Welcome to episode 35 of the First Person Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the gameplay and story found within Disco Elysium. I am your host, Sabrina Sgandurra, the Associate Commentaries Editor of First Person Scholar.
I'm Axel Hassen Taiari. I'm doing my master's degree in literature, culture, and media, writing a thesis on single-player CRPGs, and I'm also a fiction writer, and my first novel will be coming out next year.
I'm Lindsay Meaning. I'm a PhD candidate at U of Waterloo, writing a dissertation about material traces of empire and colonialism in the worlds of RPG games.
And I'm Rob Parker. I'm a managing editor for First Person Scholar. I research roguelikes and interactive fiction on the side.
And today, we're going to start off the podcast by observing the role-playing and story aspects, along with a few additional topics. And if anybody wants to talk about anything else, just let me know. But to kick things off, let's first look at what our first impressions were of Disco Elysium versus how we view it now that we've played the game.
I can go ahead and jump in with that. My first impressions of the game were I found it very unique. I was drawn in by the aesthetics and the writing before the game even began. Just the loading screen, the aesthetics of the art, I found unique in my experience of gaming. But pretty quickly that changed to absolute delight with the game. I think that the moment I realized that a labor dispute was central to the plot, and I was able to choose very leftist political dialogue options, that's where I started being delighted with the game. And that feeling has continued. I feel excited every time I open it up to play. 45 hours so far, so.
That is so awesome on so many levels and very intense. I love it.
You should see the number of hours I have in Civilization. 55 is nothing.
Yeah, in my case, for better or for worse, I got to the discourse around the game before I got to the game, and so that colored my expectations a little bit. Had heard all the rumblings around racist dialogue choices or sexist dialogue choices, but eventually I just booted up the game to see what was going on for myself, and I was quite on edge the first hour or so until dialogue choices opened up and I realized that, wow, there's something there. This is really serious. And watching the passive skill checks go off in the background, watch the dialogues adopt to whatever I was doing at the time. And by now I think I'm on my third playthrough, and it never stops being incredible. It is really a special game.
I think, like Axel, I saw that the game existed. I'd been kind of following some of the development, but not super closely. And I think it was an early Waypoint Radio podcast about Disco Elysium, where I think Austin Walker specifically was calling out sort of that there seemed to be something there, but also was a little bit leery of it, in part because of including those sort of racist, sexist, homophobic dialogue options, or the opportunities to play that version of the police officer, the protagonist, and eventually, like, it seemed like the conversations kind of shifted, and I think in part also it was Axel messaging me a bunch. But like, no, listen, this game isn't what you think it is. This isn't just starting off as like leftist. That guy in your MFA made a CRPG where there was like a lot of quote unquote writerly writing, but also a bunch of edgelord shit in there. This game goes somewhere, and it actually there's a lot happening within those mechanisms. And I think I still haven't been able to finish it. In part, I guess a little bit about myself. I had a death in the family, and I didn't want to associate the game with that. so I kind of dropped it after playing about 20, 25 hours. And in the past week, I've been doing nothing but playing that game between bouts of playing Animal Crossing. And I think for me, the world building and the camaraderie that you have with Detective Kim is absolutely like some of my favorite character moments in any game. It harkens back to Planescape Torment for me in a lot of ways, but also seems like it's a greater than even the sum of those parts. Even if I do have some misgivings about some of the other writing directions.
Yeah, those are all really great points. I know for myself, admittedly, I had no idea what this game even was. I just remember Lindsay going on and on about it during like, I don't know, one of our meetings or whatever that we were part of. And then I had another friend that all of a sudden was texting me about it. And, but I didn't actually, said friend did not give me a lot of detail about what was in the game. He just simply said, go play it. So being the online shopping addict that I am, I'm like, sure, I'll buy a game that I've never heard of and know nothing about. That sounds like something I would totally do. And it was super intriguing, first because of the really eerie intro and the strange but also uncannily familiar setting. And the sort of, it was almost like a cartoony, but simultaneously not at all cartoony aesthetic. And I'm not quite sure what the word would be for that. So, first impressions when I open up this game were like, oh, wow, this looks really fun, because it's almost nostalgic of like playing older, like an older version of Diablo that I used to watch my dad play, just based on sort of how it moves. But then at the same time, it still seems very current and relevant with a lot of other things. But then you get into the dialogue, and the dialogue is very, in my opinion, very deep for all of the reasons that we were bringing up about, you can make your character a misogynistic, racist kind of just jerk, for lack of a better term. But then at the same time, you can be this like anti-fascist hero, and I found that really, really interesting. And that kind of segues nicely into our next question, which is that Disco Elysium opens up by dabbling in some really heavy subject matter, giving you dialogue options that let you role play as, that misogynistic, racist cop, or otherwise. And so I'm wondering, how do you guys feel the game handled this? Like, do you think it managed to say anything useful with these options, or would it have just overall been better without? Was it just trivial? What are all of your thoughts?
I guess my original fear was that it would be trivial, just, as Rob mentioned, just some edgelord stuff. But this game cannot be separated from its politics and from its political content. It's just all over the place, and there's an incredible depth even to the stupidest dialogue choices, especially the racist stuff in particular. If you okay, this is a late response to what Austin Walker said a few months back regarding, being disappointed that you can't actually really play a feminist in the game. But the thing is, you're not playing a blank slate of a character. You're playing someone with a history. He has just forgotten what that history is, and you end up, if you do internalize feminism, the game literally tells you, maybe you were that once upon a time, but what you remember now is kind of, it's peeling and smells of liquor. And that kind of tone keeps going all over the place. If you internalize racism from the big dude whose name I can't remember.
I believe his name is Measurehead, which is a reference to measuring physical features. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you look closely at the stats it gives you, you lose points in drama because you are fooled by the absurdity of it, and you gain points in conceptualization because his racial theories are mostly aesthetic. They're just on the surface. There's nothing to it. And so the game keeps doing that over and over again. And so I do think it adds a lot, because my sense is that if you try to play it as a extremely racist character, the lack of logic involved, you have to barrel through that to keep up the delusion, if you will. The game keeps telling you, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't it. So yeah, it's impressive. I'm not sure it's flawless or that is not problematic in some spots, but it's yeah, very impressive.
I certainly agree with everything that you've said. Another consequence, the game pushing back against you choosing the racist dialogue options, is the relationship with Kim, which is worsened, I believe, by going with these racist dialogue options. And you get Kim, who is, again, that relationship is central to the game. You get him being disappointed in you. And emotionally, I think that's difficult for someone who's invested in the game.
Yeah, I think Kim does an incredible amount of work for that game. As far as he's just so well written and so well characterized, and in almost every instance, almost every one of my favorite moments in this game, whenever he like interjects or like, again, whenever you basically behave like you're playing a CRPG, when you have a quest to go find your gun, because at the start of this game you've gone on a bender, lost your badge, your gun, and later is revealed your car. So you can just start bringing this up with random people in the streets, and every single time you bring up your missing gun to some stranger or possible murder suspect, you can just, like, the way that they write him and the way that the game kind of pivots to bring him into the frame, you just see like this guy pinching the bridge of his nose, just going like, this fucking idiot, like, why did I get stuck with him? But then as the game progresses, you kind of see like they do a really great job of modeling sort of that camaraderie there, and they do it in such a way, like, the only other comparison I would have is sort of Morrigan from the first Dragon Age games, where every time you're agreeing to go and help people, she's like, this doesn't help save the world, this is a waste of our time. Admittedly, she's skewing even further to the right as far as like, well, it's a, dog eat dog world, whatever, blah blah blah, she's has other problems. But at the time, it was shocking to have a character just be like, why are you doing this? What is wrong with you? Why are you sprinting everywhere? Why are you telling everyone about your missing gun? You're supposed to be investigating this murder. But also, what I appreciate is that the game fronts like it's a police investigation, but as it goes on, like, that almost gets completely jettisoned. And the stuff that every now and then Kim will be like, oh, I don't think this is relevant to the case, and ultimately it actually kind of does wind up becoming either relevant to the case or more important than the case. When he's like, oh, we shouldn't go and investigate these cryptids, and then at the very end of the game, a cryptid steps out from behind the curtain. They do a really phenomenal job of handling him as sort of the straight man, but also he's not the metric for truth in the world either.
It's true. He's presented as a moral intern, or at least he used to be, and that centrism is mocked just as much as every other ideology in the game, or not mocked, but queried, I suppose.
Something that really interests me about what you just said, Rob, was about that camaraderie between the character and Kim and the player character. How do you think that works when you have a player? For instance, I'm thinking of a player that might be more invested in, I just want to try to mess with this game as much as possible, as we tend to see a lot of YouTube gamers like to do. So how do you think that camaraderie sort of comes out or functions with the gameplay when you have a player that's going to actively undermine it consistently?
So yeah, I think one of the things I find really useful or interesting is about the way Disco Elysium kind of handles that stuff is your stats argue with you. Like you have those attributes that kind of govern how much you can max out a certain skill, but you have a bunch of different stats that are kind of related to intellect or is it intellect, psychic abilities, physiology, and whatever. And those stats will argue with you, and there are actually some pivotal moments in the game where they're arguing amongst themselves. So like logic will pop up, and then rhetoric will pop up, and this happens during one moment where you're realizing that you're basically in love with this person who may be a murder suspect, and you're basically coming unraveled. You're not able to function properly because you realize that like there's this huge emotional investment that, and she also knows how to push those buttons and manipulate you. So they're aware of that, but it's just pure chaos on the screen. And I think, as Axel mentioned, if you have enough points in logic will point out every single time, like what you're saying doesn't make sense, or like this stuff doesn't actually make sense. And so when you do have streamers kind of doing that stuff, you still do have that text rolling through on the screen. You still have a bit more of an in-game challenge to whatever the hell they're trying to do. If they are trying to play that extremely misogynistic, racist cop, you're still getting those counter arguments running through the screen. They can click through them as quickly as they can, but I mean, it's something where that wouldn't exist in basically any other game.
It was, this is a very, very authored game, and I mean that. I don't say that very often, but I really mean that as a compliment in this case. And the camaraderie with Kim, and just the presence of other NPCs. What I appreciate the most, I think, about Disco Elysium, beyond the writing, is really I don't think that NPCs have stats. They are not a bundle of attributes and properties and numbers. They are representations, primarily textual, given the amount of words, but they are there for us to read, if you will. And so that does so much of the heavy lifting for what Kim is. At some point, you can push back against Kim and ask him to tell you a secret, I believe, and there's an extremely high authority check. And even if you pass that, the only thing you notice, the game only tells you the Kim he has high authority. That's all the game says. There's no secret forthcoming. Even if you have the highest stat in whatever, the maximum chance of succeeding at any task is 97%. The world can always push back. It'll never be taken over by numbers or you min-maxing. And so that to me was really stunning, and I've tried to pay close attention to people like Josh Sawyer, who were talking about like now, saying I feel bad about making Fallout New Vegas because this puts my work to shame. And I think I hope RPGs will learn from that on how to create how to make you bond with characters through that lack of simulation.
Yeah, that's also a really interesting factor to think about. Another thing that I wanted to sort of pull out was actually you had talked about, or you briefly mentioned that it is still problematic, this entire the way this is set up in terms of how it deals with the racism, the sexism, and all of that. So although I have my own opinions, I want to know what your opinion is on what is problematic about this, because we talked about what it does well and how it handles it well, but how does it handle it poorly?
I think the representation of the female characters in the game is tries to. They are very aware of noir and neo-noir tropes, but I'd like to hear other people go first before I jump in with that.
I would agree with that, but one thing I was sort of thinking of was that the misogynistic and the racist dialogue choices appear to be very tied for most of the game to the one ideology, the fascist ideology, right? They're the ones that generate the I forget what it's called, the Revicolian nationhood thought. They're coded as the fascist sort of dialogue options. But it troubled me for a lot of the game because it felt like relegating those attitudes to that specific political leaning ignored a lot of the ways that these attitudes can be found throughout the political spectrum in everyone. But then at the end of the game, it turns out that, are we allowed to do spoilers here?
I mean, I already talked about the Phasmid cryptid.
Yeah.
So
That's true. But when at the end of the game it turned out that the killing was very much motivated by misogyny in the sexual obsession and objectification of an old communist whose ideologies have been twisted to hatred, that was a left turn that I really appreciated in the game as someone who's encountered these attitudes in the leftist spaces where you'd think that they would be absent, but they never are.
You said it better than I could, I think. I think in wrestling with some not so extreme nowadays, unfortunately, but certain ideological positions, the game forgets about the hegemonic reinscriptions that are there in everyday chat or so-called, culturally accepted beliefs, and there are some blind spots there about what would be the femme fatale role in a noir movie. They try to, spin that around a little bit, but you still have a primarily female character who is there to occupy that role. It being meta or self-aware doesn't quite solve it. And so, but yeah, the turn at the end with all the conversations that happen on the island did a lot to, not sure about redeeming, but framing at least what happens throughout the game. It's just a lot of trust though that you have to put into the game, right? To have that that sort of framing, let's say, happen after 40 hours. I just wish it happened a little bit earlier.
I completely agree with sort of that take that if there was one misgiving I had about, or if I was to try to sum up a good chunk of sort of a lot of connected misgivings, it's that I love noir, crime fiction, neo-noir. Like I will watch trash or read trash from that just because I like watching how the genre gets deformed and worked with. I like watching that work being done. It's the same reason why I like watching horror movies. I know all of those tropes, they are all very legible, but I always like looking for those wrinkles or whatever. And I think in this game, actually, the problem is almost it almost hews too close to that. Like at the end of the day, you do have a lot of opportunities to play a leftist character and explore some of the tensions and challenges there. But at the end of the day, you're still a cop. Like you're still limited in terms of the types of dialogue that you can have, because at the end of the day, someone's still going to be like, hey, you are still here in your capacity as a police officer. There's no way to fully abandon your post, as I understand it. And I think part of it is also, I think it probably has something to do with just the amount of time it took to write this. There's an incredible amount of text here. This was written over a huge amount of time, and even in the course of like a few years, people changed very dramatically in sort of their understanding of the world, especially the world itself, as we understand the organization of politics. I was joking with Axel earlier tonight that one of the themes about Disco Elysium seems to be like the idea of posting through it, of someone being online and always on the someone on Twitter. They've stuck their foot in their mouth, and instead of log off and think about what they've said, they just keep posting to continue the conversation when really they need to just back up for a minute. And I think you see that in around the edges of this game where there are some dirtbag left tropes from Twitter or some occasional edgelordy or off-color jokes. But there's once you kind of get a few days into the game, it takes on a much more melancholy turn, and you can start seeing a little bit more maturity here and there around the way that it treats certain positions. And again, I think at the very end, that decision to make like the final killer, this misogynistic communist, to kind of sort of complicate some of what were like pretty strictly drawn lines. I wouldn't be surprised if that decision came pretty late in the writing process. Again, I'm speculating, but I think part of it is just this is also a game that was written by people that were probably sorting a lot of these things out by themselves in a world that has become increasingly fraught over time, and there's only so much editing you can do to kind of patch over some of that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think I like that concept of posting through it. I hadn't thought of that, but now that I think back on the game, that's absolutely what's going on. So that I'm totally stealing that term. So thanks for that.
No problem.
I think one other thing that I just wanted to pull out based on what we've been saying this like throughout this whole thing for this question was the internalized histories or internalization of whatever gets brought up increasingly. And for those of us in this podcast, we're all sort of, for lack of a better term, trained to analyze a game enough to pull out on these things, like pull out what we ourselves are internalizing and how that's being reflected in the game. But do you all think that this game does a good job for players who might not actually be trained to overanalyze every single aspect of every single game? Do you think it sort of communicates that even to like the average player that's just sort of like, oh, this is a new game that I just kind of want to try?
I think that a game like this would tend to attract thoughtful players in general, or at least only thoughtful players would tend to stick with it just because of the, I don't want to sound wrong here, but the amount of reading and the melancholiness and the slow pace of the game, I think, would tend to attract a certain type of player that might be willing to look deeper, or a player who's in the mood to look deeper when at other times they might be in the mood to just shoot things, right? So I think that the game does do a pretty good job in that sense, but I'd be interested in hearing other people's thoughts.
Yeah, there's no doubt that it's such a weird experience. It really the game imposes such a specific temporality as you play through it, and it's not just about the word count. There's something about how all the elements come together. I don't know that it is particularly good at guiding anyone's hand ideologically or otherwise. I don't think it needs to do that either. I would hope not. But I've seen a lot of frustrated posts about the ending. Let's say that much. People who definitely got through 40 plus hours and ended up saying, "Well, what the hell is this? The that's the resolution to the crime. That's how you solve it. That's not a good crime story." And I was just reading those posts thinking, did you miss all the parts that have nothing to do with crime? That this is way more magical realism or straight up fantasy in some cases, and the crime only matters so much. And so it's a hard one to answer. I think what it does extremely well, and anyone who's not in for that kind of experience anyway would probably bounce after the first few hours of reading text for 15 minutes straight.
I think this does ride a bit of a line between interactive fiction and God, I'm drawing a line between quote unquote real games and interactive fiction. That's the old IF head in me coming out. But I think it does ride this line between, on the one hand, it's approachable. It's not parser based. It's not you're just kind of clicking dialogue options. But I think you are going to get more players coming to this than you would expect, that would be probably more home, playing a first-person shooter or a strategy game or something like that, who gravitate towards games with that immediacy, in terms of you do something and something happens, and typically it's something spectacular. I think the strength of the game's writing and its willingness to go with you on just doing really ridiculous, absurd stuff. Part of the fun is kind of pushing this game to see how far it's going to go with you. And as we learned from Harry very early on, is he's down for whatever. He he's gonna jump a canal with his police car just for whatever reasons, and then crawl out talking about how he's Tequila Sunset now. Um, and I think that there is a spectacle to that, even if it's not necessarily what we would usually see as that kind of spectacular writing. And I think just the fact that the game is accounting for so much does mean you're probably going to go to a wider audience. I think that's why you can kind of point to the success of this game. Is you probably do have that first core group of players, that kind of the first wave of players that are already primed for this, already played, Planescape Torment, Tides of Numenera, Pillars of Eternity, like played those CRPGs, like those isometric RPGs with like a lot of dialogue options, a lot of things to do. I mean, you look at you look at Mass Effect and Dragon Age, all huge franchises of games, an incredible amount of reading, an incredible amount of dialogue. I think that there's an audience there for that. And I think probably a lot of, like, one of the game's strengths is that, yes, it is mapping to specific sort of political positions and traditions and modes of thought, but it has its whole cloth own world history and lore, essentially. One of the things I desperately want is, like, I just want history of the world. Like, I want a historian of, like, Revachol. I want a historian of the overall, like, islands. I want to know, like, because there's an incredible amount of depth there, and I think gamers are very, very good at just internalizing lore and going with it, and not necessarily asking too many questions. I think one of the smartest things this game does is kind of cloak some of that stuff in, like, oh, these are all made up place names. So you're not going to get those immediate knee-jerk responses to, like, oh, we're talking about, like, Venezuela here, or we're, they're still using words like socialism and communism, but it's in such a context, it's framed in such a way that is, I think it throws people off enough that you're going to get a wider audience of people that are open to that, rather than. I mean, there were still posts from gamers that were like, "Why is there all this politics in my video game?" Because they're still gamers, but I think you still hit a wider audience that it seemed like this game did really well. So, yeah.
What I would be interested to find out is how people who did not want to play other RPGs because of the combat or because of the strategic angle ended up, is this someone's first RPG is what I think I'm asking here. And if so, how does that experience shape playing Baldur's Gate after this? Because the lack of combat does so much when it comes to accessibility and being immersed in the world, and not this is that interactive fiction line, right? It's you're so close to the text, and there's not much that gets in the way other than you playing with it.
I could speak to that. I do play many RPGs, but I'm not great at combat. I don't love combat. There's a reason I always go with Stealth Archer in Skyrim, because I can do it slowly and plan and keep my distance. So I loved the lack of combat in this game. I think it's what really made me fall in love with it, was the fact that after 20 hours, I still hadn't really fought anybody. I found that personally appealing.
When that big tense confrontation happens, and it has the look of a combat scene, it certainly smells like a combat scene, there are weapons involved, but I don't know that I've ever been that tense, certainly in any other RPG, but probably this is my most tense gaming moment ever. The non-action slows down, and I don't know that I again, third playthrough, I don't know that I've wrapped my mind around how they structured that encounter with the mercenaries, but it is it is more dramatic and more engaging than, mindlessly butchering goblins for 20 hours in a row.
I would fully agree with that. That scene was incredibly powerful because it was so singular in that it was the only real violence happening on screen.
And if anybody else has anything else to say about this, otherwise we can move on to the next question.
I just wanted to say, Rob, you were talking about how you wanted a history. I don't know if you know, and if you do, the listeners of this will be interested to find out that the author of the game is publishing a book set in the world in 2020. I can't quite recall what it's called. He's also stated that he's doing sequels, and his last project will be publishing the tabletop world and system for Revocall. Well, I'm not sure what the greater world is called, but you will hopefully get a lot of history at some point or other.
I think Axel had mentioned that there was a tabletop thing coming out, which sounds incredible. I will be reactivating my Roll20 subscription because that sounds terrific. And yeah, I mean, if there's a sequel, like surely they have to go to Jamrock, right? Like that's got to be the next step, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And with talking about all of the ways that this game sort of pushes boundaries and the way players can push boundaries, that brings us to our third question, which is basically, so one of the main things about Disco Elysium that a lot of enthusiast press have been mentioning was how much freedom there is and how much freedom it affords players. And basically, what I want to know is, what do we even mean when we talk about freedom in RPGs specifically? And how do we square that sense of freedom with what Disco Elysium does in terms of, player choice or game mechanics, things like that?
Now, keep in mind, I'm in the middle of this nightmare thesis that pretty much deals with this, as well as interpolation and how the player is manipulated through most RPGs. So I think I'm not quite sure what we mean by freedom, but at least the illusion of the text restructuring itself for us. But it is such a situated requirement on our part. We have so many expectations. I think this is a something that occurs more in Western RPGs, right? The blank state character that you'll create your own hero, whereas when you play something like Final Fantasy, Cloud is a character and you accept it. And I think we have to see Disco Elysium somewhere in between those two types of heroes. Clearly, Harry is he has a past, and not the greatest past at that. But if there is freedom, it is not so much found in the mechanics or the branching paths, for that matter. It is just in the fact that you're not really wrestling with stats. The world is not that encoded. The world is primarily represented, and what you do with that, that's just interpretation, right? And so I would say there's not much room for mechanical subversion in the game, but there's plenty to talk about as you're playing it and after you're done playing it, as we're doing now. And I don't know. I know this is not a controversial place to say that games are art, but I think that's kind of what makes good art at the end of the day.
I would certainly agree with that. And I think that the sense of freedom in this game, it comes from the fact that we rarely get the choice to shape the interiority of a character, what drives and motivates them. Like, I know he has history, but we're the ones that shape his psyche. Usually the freedom of choice in RPGs is skin outwards, like what we can do. And in this game, we're saying, well, why are we doing it? What is driving our choices? And I think that level of depth feels like freedom, even though in the game itself, mechanically, like you said, there isn't actually that much freedom. I mean, when you move in the world, it's not a huge world. Parts of it are time gated. You can't interact freely with the environment, like blowing everything up, like in some RPGs, but there's still that immense sense of emotional depth that translates.
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on a little bit of this earlier, so I won't belabor the point, but I think Lindsay, you nailed it on the head, right? Like you don't get to shape who Harry is, or at least who he was, but you do get to shape sort of how he accounts or reckons with who he was and who he is right now. I kind of waffled back and forth on, was it a smart idea for them to play with that whole, like, was this just a trope, in that Harry wakes up and has no memory of himself? Was this just, oh, haha, we're doing the amnesiac protagonist again, but, oh, there's actually a history here. We've played Planescape Torment, we get it. But I think there was moments where you are kind of accounting with that. One, the strength of the writing helps sell that in a lot of ways. And sort of the pacing and the way that they frame certain scenes. Again, I kind of gestured at it earlier, but day 3, you can finally cross the canal and you see this car that has crashed into the shore, and you have this incredible moment with Kim where you just sit on the swing and you can whistle with one another if you pass the skill check, and you can just have this like really lovely moment of the two of you sitting on the swing, and he knows. And watches the ice melts. And so as the ice melts, you eventually realize that, oh, this is actually your car. In fact, actually, you did this. And Kim has an idea that this is what happened, but doesn't let you know. He just kind of sits there in peace. And your response to it and the way that your stats argue with you about trying to deny this reality, made that moment unique, or feel unique to me, or at least unique to the character that I was playing in my mind and the way that I built him. Understand that like everyone hits that point. It's just depending on what kind of stats pipe up in the dialogue. And I think that's the game's strength, right? Is allowing you a pretty wide range of responses to different situations, even if you're still basically moving from one plot point to the next, or ignoring some entirely. That's another thing.
After digesting God knows how many noir and crime novels, the amnesia narrative is it's pretty tired by now, but that Disco Elysium redeemed it for me, because it made me. I think the developers are aware that what Harry is going through is actually what you go through as a player through when you play most RPGs. You're never really adding information to the text or to the game. You're materializing it, or you're digging and bringing it to the surface. And there's this very odd meta level where you putting your memories back together, but realizing that they're colored and they're never neutral and they always come from somewhere. Yeah, you can alter them a little bit, but ultimately you're just digging up bits of data. And I don't know that another game can repeat it. I hope so, but it's I don't know. It's just stunning. And this is the one case where amnesia is this weird machinistic process that's present throughout the narrative.
And I think that the amnesia is really important thematically. There was a real sense of forgetting versus remembering being a central issue in everyone. I mean, the final murder reveal, it's a man who can't forget what he's seen, whose memories have twisted him up so much, but at the same time, parts of him are sort of being erased by this phasmid. So is it better to remember? Is it better to try and forget and become a blank slate? It was really really art.
Yeah.
If I did have one frustration, I guess, or maybe frustration is too strong of a word. There's not quite a like where do we go from here next in this game. Like it's and maybe games don't need that. Maybe that's me imposing something on a game that seems to have a pretty solid sort of leftist lean as far as it's all around you is this deep melancholy, this deep weight of history that that honestly all we can do is just kind of thrash around in and wait until entropy consumes us all, I guess.
Yep.
Which, okay, fair.
Would you call the game nihilistic? I'm curious.
I wouldn't, because no, I think and that's I think you see shades of that. I think you see shades of like I was thinking of it in terms of like my fear was that this game would be, the person who read, a little bit of nihilistic theory and then stopped and was just like, well, nothing matters, so we might as well be assholes to each other, as opposed to, okay, life is inherently meaningless, blah 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 blah. There's no meaning but what you bring to it. Therefore, maybe we should try to build a better world. Maybe there's value in doing that labor because there's nothing else to do. But try to build that better world. And you see shades of that. You see shades of like them trying to come around to that, but also just being at a loss as to what to do next. Because again, just the weight of that history, the weight of that anguish, is there's a genuine sadness to it. That again, resonated with me. Like I think this is a remarkably timely game for something that has probably been, someone's been working on writing this thing for, I have to assume, a decade at this point, in some way, shape, or form. Even if the proper writing for this game has only been, a few years.
Yeah, I believe it's easily over. Yeah, a solid decade in the making, and for the melancholy aspect of it, I cannot remember who put it this way, but someone said that this is just a game written by a bunch of broken-hearted leftists. So, people who saw a form of communism rise and then fall apart, or at least the idea of it, and then have to live in the ruins of that and not quite know what to do. And it works here. I'm excited to see what's next, if anything. But what do you do? Do you keep playing in the ruins? Which I think that's the only choice, and you try to do what's best in there. But whether you can recreate that experience and on some level, I'll be hopeful. So I guess that's the non-nihilist answer. I'll say hopeful.
No, I think there's a lot of places the sequel could go, because, as you said, it's left sort of, where do we go next? Well, hopefully the next game.
Yeah, I think like there would have been. I think almost in retrospect, there probably, you can look at that game and think of different ways where it might have been able to move the needle, where it didn't foreclose on, well, the union is endlessly corrupt and there's no way to save it, and stuff like that, where there is that hope. I mean, you spent a lot of time talking to Joyce, and I came away from that conversation like she seems very clearly like, yeah, I was a centrist essentially. But I came away from that conversation with her that like she's thought a lot about it, and she's on that ledge. You could probably, like, if there was a few more days, if there wasn't the end of the world pressing down on the two of you, you could have probably grabbed a drink at Whirling in Rags. Maybe you should probably have a coffee, but given Harry's background, or just a water. Maybe that dude just needs water for a while. He just needs to hydrate. But chill and have a conversation and hypothetically like have that bring her over to your side even.
I think that a large part of this game was the dangers of placing ideology of any kind over human lives. And which is why it skewers every ideology, even centrism. So in that respect, it's a very humanist sort of message, not nihilist really, but again, well, if you don't have any ideas, how do you sort of guide this humanist worldview?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I personally appreciated the most about having so many dialogue choices, is that while like I couldn't necessarily go everywhere and anywhere whenever I wanted, and in some cases it would, for like I'm thinking mostly at the beginning when you're talking, or closer to the beginning when you're talking to Kim at one point. He asks, I don't even remember what the question was, but essentially he asks you something, and oh, it was with the dead body, and you have so many different choices to pick, and then eventually it forces you to pick. I think that it was just simply no, I haven't taken it down, and his reactions were great. But I think that's like the, if there is a semblance of freedom, then that freedom is to, like, you're free to pick the ideology and make the game reflect your own thoughts on what's going on, because it doesn't push you towards one ideology or another. It just presents all of them in this particular context and says, go have fun.
I'm not sure that it presents them all as equally valid, though. And again, I don't, like, that was a thing that I is there a way to have a fulfilling, quote unquote, experience playing just a hard-nosed cop? Like, just play this game as only a police officer and dramatically disinterested in anything else, and in any of the political discussions. I don't know how you progress through the game like that.
I'm not sure. Falling into leftist dialogue was like this game's version of Stealth Archer for me. I tried to play a different model, but I couldn't stop myself.
I definitely kept doing this, and I haven't even finished my first playthrough yet either, right? So I'd imagine that it would probably be a little bit different if I kept replaying it. But I just find that I just keep falling into that sort of same thing, Lindsay, because like that's just what I would pick, and I don't.
Right.
And when I'm presented with all these options, I'm like, I don't know what I would do as this character. I'm just gonna do what I would do in real life.
And for the same reason, I could not bring myself to choose the misogynistic or racist dialogue options. Like, I could not do it. It caused me physical pain, practically.
I specifically was trying to make decisions that I thought would be like the best move for Harry, in like assuming that he genuinely wants to keep going.
Yeah.
And doesn't quite know how to do it, and so like when the stuff was coming up about like getting in touch with his ex, I was my dude, you've burned that bridge. Like, do not stop it. Like, stop trying to call your ex. I only have a sense of what you were doing, and I don't want to know more because you probably ruined this person's life. She doesn't want to hear from you.
100%. I remember there are quite a few moments that made me really gasp as I played. One was Joyce, the moment where she really reveals that she's a centrist, or as she says, I believe she says something like, "I am the worst thing, an ultra
liberal, or something."
Yeah,
like that,
and I just like, I'm glad my chair supported my weight, because I would have collapsed. It was that great of a moment. But I think what I'm trying to articulate is that even after now 3 playthroughs again, there are still some dialogue choices that I just can't bring myself to pick. And ultimately it ends up being like Harry with empathy, very smart Harry, or as in the latest case, muscular Harry. But I'll never, I made that mistake once. I will never dial the X again in the middle of the night, because I've seen how that scene unfolds, and it is just heart-wrenching. So yeah, that is, my dude, just stop. It's okay. Just
I'm kind of interested now in playing a himbo Harry, where I just max out physical instrument and empathy and then nothing else. Just a big, kind hunk who fell on some hard alcohol.
It is, I have to say, I expected the sort of high intellect, whatever, the visual calculus Harry to be my favorite. But no, the the sweet Harry, who has a lot of empathy and lifts a lot of weights, is my favorite so far. Especially if you start bumping up, I believe it is what authority, whatever the police trait is, that, and you start bonding with Kim even more.
Oh, that's Esprit de Corps, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. That's I don't know if any of you had a conversation with Kim where you figure out that he used to be a pinball champion of sorts.
What?
Is it okay if I talk about it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Please do.
Please.
It's when you're at the Whirl in Rags, and you're in that closed off section, and you can start talking to Kim about the pinball machines that are there. and you suddenly remember that really his name, as you know it, is Kim Pinball Kitsuragi, or also known as the Kimball. And turns out that he worked with juveniles for many years, up until his mid-30s, I believe, which also explains why he doesn't want to talk to Kuno very much. He doesn't want to do that anymore. And eventually he went undercover and for some reason had to become a pinball expert in a matter of 9 months. And he became that and pulled it off. And once he got out of that assignment, he came to despise pinball, and he thinks it's just the dumbest thing you can do. It takes no skills and it's just pretty lights. And having that conversation surrounded by a couple of pinball machines in a building that's falling apart, that is one of my all-time favorite gaming moments for sure.
That also explains why he didn't want to go inside the tent with the youths outside the church.
Yep.
Huh. Interesting. But that dude's still a speed demon. Has anyone else talked to him about cars?
Yeah, he loves the cars. I do that.
I love that part of him.
He really is the best character.
He's incredible. So yeah, fast cars, yes. Pinball, no.
Youths, definitely not. I'm on his side there.
How did people deal with Kuno?
Oh my gosh, that kid.
I sunk traits into empathy to try to figure out what was going on with him, and then you meet his dad, and I felt for him. I did.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie. This is gonna make me sound like a terrible person. So in real life, I adore children. This is the first time I think that I have felt, and it's like it's a fictional child, so I can't feel too much guilt. But this is the first time I actually like hated a kid, and it's just because I was so caught off guard with the amount of attitude. I'm like, I just want to throw a shoe at him because that's what my like grandmother would have done or something. Like, yeah, that's just.
No, Kuno is one of those characters that he really is written to get on your nerves at first, for sure. After that, it's a matter of whether his if you manage to dig into his backstory and see what a shitty, terrible life he's had. That really turned me around. Yeah, again, meeting his father or having an encounter with the dad. Yeah, I didn't get that. I don't know how. Can you become friends with Kuno?
I believe if Kim gets injured and something else happens, you can actually bring Kuno along as a junior detective. I haven't unlocked it myself.
That's the end game I'm angling for, I think. But I don't want Kim to get hurt. But I need to see it.
I can't imagine. I can. This is something that will never happen in any of my playthroughs. I cannot get to the island without Kim. We've been through too much. That bond is too powerful.
Plus, Kim has that camera, and Kuno does not have a camera.
True.
So no one believes you about the Phasmid with Kuno.
One specific detail that because I was able to wrangle my way into figuring out Kuno's backstory, because the first day I was completely befuddled by this kid. I was like, I was messaging Steve Wilcox, former EIC for FPS, and I was like, man, what did you do with Kuno? He's like, I just punched him. I was like, you write about ethics a lot, my dude. I don't know how you did this. You care a lot about the world. You just socked this kid. But all right.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. I put Steve on blast here. But one of my favorite things is when I was able to finally get through to him. There were two things, I guess. One was I think it was either Inland Empire or Shivers. One of them was chattering in my ear the whole time that was like, Kuno's not the problem here, it's Kuno S. The girl that's yelling from behind the fence is like, this is the evil presence in his life. When you like can kind of get his guard down, Kuno's like actually terrified of her. But also one of the things that he does is make a like throwaway reference to William Gibson's Neuromancer. And I'm like, of course this little petulant kid is also enamored with Neuromancer, and it just made me think of like Tim Sorrett, the dev for they got Milkshake Ducked at E3. He showed off this really great like the really, I guess, aesthetically striking adventure looking game that was like on the Xbox stage, and everyone was like, oh man, we wanted to know about that. And then this dude got in front of a microphone and immediately was just like, well, the backstory of the game is like universal basic income happened, and then no one was pushed to strive anymore, and blah blah blah. And it came with it. He was a Gamergate supporter and a bunch of other stuff. It was like the idea of like this little toxic munchkin as like the people who have missed the point of cyberpunk. They see all the neon and they miss the burning oil fields in Blade Runner. You know, like that sort of thing. It was like this beautiful moment of like, all right. That was good. That's good. Nicely done.
And I think with that, we are ready to wrap it up. So once again, my name is Sabrina Sgandurra. You can find me on Twitter at Sabrina Alicia SG, and I am the Associate Commentaries Editor for First Person Scholar.
Axel Hassen Taiari. You can find me on Twitter at Axel_Hext.
I'm Lindsay Meaning. You're probably not going to find me on Twitter, but
Clean living.
Yep, that's me.
I'm Rob Parker. I'm managing editor of FPS. You can find me on Twitter at RobotParking. I barely tweet anymore because the world's a horrible hellscape. But if you at me, I'll see it. I'll respond.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being part of this podcast, and thanks to all of you listeners for listening to us talk about our role-playing game experiences and what these experiences mean on a broader scale. So what do you think about what we had to say? Let us know what you aim to get from games like Disco Elysium or other role-playing games, and who your favorite characters are to roleplay. And you can find us at FPS Weekly on Twitter, or start the conversation using the hashtag FirstPersonPodcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.